I'll start off by welcoming everyone very warmly to the fourth lecture in our series on how to interpret images, which is part of the International Association for Archaeological Research in Western Central Asia, the Art History and Visual Study series that runs from April to June 2024. Unfortunately, Kathy Draycott, with whom we are co-running this series, cannot join us today as well, but hopefully from next week we will have her back. And before introducing our speaker today, I would just like to mention that if you look at the chat, I'm not sure if you can see, I have put some messages there. The first one is that membership in ARWA is free for 2024, and this may be especially interesting for students, and that the whole series of lectures can be seen through the link. There is a YouTube channel that I have also put on the chat. This is the second message, and I will soon add another message alerting you to all the lecture series taking place under the ARWA Academy. At this point, I would like to introduce our speaker, who has very graciously accepted our invitation. We're very honored to have Professor Rubina Raja today with us. I'm sure many of you know her, but let me just share a very brief overview. Professor Raja is a professor in classical archaeology and art in Aarhus University. She runs a center of excellence on urban networks from antiquity to the medieval period, and she is the founding editor of the Journal of Urban Archaeology, that I'm sure that would welcome articles. I think, Rubina, am I right? From colleagues. It's a very, very important journal. And her research primarily focuses on the archaeology and visual culture of the Hellenistic, Roman, and late antique period, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. And today, she will talk to us about images in context, contextualizing the Palmyrene portraits. So join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Rubina Raja, who will speak to us today. So thank you, Rubina.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, both to you, Christina, and to Kathy also. I have known Kathy from the first day I started my studies in Oxford, because that's where we met each other. The first day of our master's there. So it's sad that she can't be here today, but I wish her all the best. So today, maybe not surprisingly, and I see that many in the room, in the audience also have shared this interest with me, I'm going to talk about Palmyra, and in particularly the Palmyrene portraits, and give you some of the results from this now more decade-long project, which soon will culminate in the publication of the more than 10-volume corpus over the funerary portraits. So Palmyra, well, ancient Tadmor, is a city which has really fascinated scholars and travelers alike for many centuries. It's come into the spotlight again, of course, since it became notoriously famous during the Syrian war, during which also its heritage has suffered tremendously. But the city has also been a focus of attention earlier as well, both as a target and also as a place from which much research sprung due to its rich cultural heritage. A heritage whose Roman past has been highlighted in particular due to the city's ruins. Let me just get the chat up here, sorry. So today I'm going to talk about, or take a longer perspective on this famous oasis city, while also bringing to the forefront the work done within the framework of the Palmyra Portrait Project, where about 4,000 funerary portraits have now been collected and studied, a study which sheds entirely new light on portrait habit in the Roman world, the duration of local traditions, and the entangledness between core and periphery in the ancient world, and begs for a reconsideration of the ways in which we perceive and study the heritage of the classical world. Tales about Palmyra was passed down from antiquity onwards, many initially set down by authors who, like Pliny the Elder, had never actually visited Palmyra. The city has continued to fascinate, providing a source of inspiration over centuries for operas, books, poems, tapestries, and paintings. And yet, despite its almost mythical status, Palmyra is also a very real location, home to a vivid past, tangible archaeological finds, and ongoing ideological importance also. In Copenhagen, the world's largest collection of Palmyrene funerary portraits outside of Syria is located, and I'll get to the story about that later. So there are 122 objects and a total of 142 funerary portraits in that collection, plus other fragments and objects, inscriptions, and a large tesserae collection also, which I'll also speak a little bit about later today. Known in antiquity and still today in modern Arabic as Tadmor, Palmyra at its largest extent covered about 140 hectares and is located in an oasis in the Syrian desert between the river Euphrates and the Mediterranean Sea. The outbreak of the civil war in Syria, of course, changed the scope also of my research on Palmyra already more than a decade ago, and now has resulted in a set of further collaborative projects revolving around cultural heritage, legacy data, and making such data widely available to the public and academic society. And some of you might know the project that I've been running on archival archaeology, which was focused on Harald Ingholt's archival material, so the legacy data from him. I have also founded a series called Archive Archaeology, which is luckily attracting a lot of attention, also involving now a lot of legacy data being published by colleagues in the series. This is the newest volume, Shaping Archaeological Archives, which focused on fieldwork and, among other things, also holds contributions on Palmyra. And last but not least, we in November hosted a conference in Copenhagen that focused on entangled cultural knowledge and archives together with Assistant Professor Olympia Bubu and Maria Stamatopoulou from Oxford, bringing together people working on the Mediterranean in a long durée perspective. So the project moved beyond the art historical and classical archaeological aims of the core project that focused on funerary portraits from the city, these almost 4,000 surviving great portraits that reshape our understanding of local urban culture in the Roman East. And here I hope to tie together various strands of data and results from the project into a larger narrative about the value of classical archaeology, cultural heritage, and importance of deep knowledge about the past also to our modern society. Palmyra sits in a region that's created by a range of hills that branches out from the Anti-Lebanon mountains and range to the northeast. And this route leads to the Syrian city of Homs and continues to the Mediterranean coast. And east of Palmyra lies the steppe desert, which only ends with the Euphrates River. There's also a natural route that leads in the direction of Damascus and passes the mouth of the Ekka Spring, while to the north of the oasis is a higher desert plateau cut through by two valleys or wadis. Before the events of the civil war in Syria, which began in 2011, Palmyra was the most visited archaeological site in Syria, and the city was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980 and attracted thousands of visitors every year. Pliny the Elder has a very well-known quote, which most of you probably know, taken from here on the screen, taken from his Natural History, and that quote plunges his reader in medias res with regard to the geography and history of the city. At the time that Pliny was writing, Palmyra was really in its Roman imperial heyday. This growth, however, came to an abrupt halt when the city was sacked, with devastating results by the Roman Emperor Aurelian in 272 CE, twice. Despite his brevity, Pliny's text offers a crucial insight into what was deemed important about Palmyra in the ancient world. Tellingly, Pliny's description focuses not only on the city of Palmyra, but also on its much wider hinterland. Palmyra demanded a managed hinterland in order to survive and sustain itself, and a good deal of research has also been done on the Palmyrena, as the hinterland is also called. The essential relationship between the city and its surroundings is testified to by documents produced throughout the Roman period, among them numerous inscriptions from the city and also the famous textary of 137 CE. The stone bearing the tariff inscription was erected on the city's main street opposite the sanctuary of Rabashire, which Gavlikovsky recently has shown, a location that's very prominent in the urban landscape. The purpose of the tariff was to resolve conflicts between local traders and tax collectors, and it features both the city's old regulations on Palmyrene trade and the new regulations that replaced them. And these were inscribed in the local Palmyrene Aramaic dialect, as well as in Greek, demonstrating clearly that these laws were intended not only for Palmyrene local society, but also for visitors and trade contexts. And of course, most of you might know the translation of the Russian work or commentary on the law by Schiffman, translated by Svetlana Kopnira, and edited by John Healy, which really remains the place to go for the commentary, most up-to-date commentary on the text reef. However, the information on the text reef is concerned exclusively with trade that came through the city itself, and therefore does not offer much detail about the trade extending into the immediate hinterland. Pliny's mentions of the fields surrounding Palmyra also reminds us that despite its desert location, the city was in fact encircled by arable land. This could have been achieved only through what must have been an intensive management of water resources, perennial or seasonal, throughout the year. Palmyrenes had a reputation for being good tradesmen and soldiers, particularly archers, but they must also have been excellent water engineers. Pliny also writes about the life-giving springs of the city. The source of the famous Evka spring was in the city itself, while there were several other springs in the surrounding area, and these provided water for general usage both in the city and its hinterland, but drinking water was apparently derived from other sources, and the Palmyrenes, at least in the Roman period, relied on water being brought into the city by aqueducts and channel systems. Estimates of the territory in the Roman period indicate that it covered an area extending some 75 kilometers to the northwest of the city up to Khirbet al-Bilas, 65 kilometers to the southwest, up towards the borders of the territories of Sura and Resafa in the northeast, and towards the river Euphrates to the southeast. As such, and with the exception of potential outposts along the Euphrates, the territory of Palmyra was fully situated in the northern part of the region that's now termed Badiat al-Sham, or the Syrian desert. Within the project, we've done a set of new phase plans of the city, trying to work on a higher resolution, chronological resolution of the development of the city. I won't say too much about that today because that's still unpublished and under development. But of course, this gives us a new way of also looking at the development, not only of the city, but also of the necropoli, the cemeteries around the city, which you see mapped out here. Also, a map that is based, of course, on the work by Schnedelbach that was published in 2010. And later I'll show you one of the case studies that we've worked together with Schnedelbach on, a Schnedelbach who is now above 90, but still going strong on the academic side of things. A lot has been said about the societal structure in Palmyra. What we know is that there were several tribes reorganized into what seems to have been 4 main tribes in the Roman period. We, of course, have to assume that that did not entirely delete the tribes that were already existing, and I might get into that later in the talk as well. The families were dominated by heads of family, family fathers, The genealogical history was extremely important and reflected sometimes in up to 5 generations in the funerary inscriptions. It was a highly bilingual society, a high awareness of which spheres used what languages. Palmyrene Aramaic was the absolute dominating language, both in the public, religious, and funerary sphere. And in total, we have more than 3,000 surviving inscriptions from the city. And I'll get to those later as well, because we've collected all of those inscriptions within the project, also not only the ones relating to portraits themselves. There was an extremely strong local religious tradition with extensive amounts of priesthood circulating or being extended within the larger families, and there's absolutely no evidence of female priesthoods. But what about the size of the population in Palmyra? Alongside with our remapping plan of Palmyra, or looking at the cities and its expansion, we've also tried to recalculate a population estimation, and also worked with food security and food production in the hinterground. Until now, it's been said by people that Palmyra, in its heyday, could have had anything from 10,000 to 200,000 inhabitants, which of course are numbers that don't really get us anywhere, so to say. So on the basis of what we know about the territory and what we know about private housing in Palmyra, which is not too much, and what we know about the development of space, we recently, in a new article, tried to recalculate how many people we have to imagine lived in Palmyra. And by combining other studies of domestic housing, for example, at Dura Europos, our new estimate is quite a bit tighter than what has been said earlier. And we've come to the conclusion that anything about between 19 and 30,000 inhabitants would have been what Palmyra and its immediate hinterland would have had in its absolute heyday. I'm not going to go into details with that study because that is published, so you can just go and read it, and you can also, I'm sure, find ways of critiquing that. But basically what I'm going to say is that we based it on the expansion of the city and a restudy of every single building and its chronology in the city, and in that way done a fairly, I would say, deep going calculation, which we've also laid entirely open for people to criticize in this article that we published in 2021 on food security in Roman Palmyra. But of course, Palmyra also existed after the sack of the Roman army in 272, and more work had been done than in the foregoing decades, right before the Civil War, by, among others, the Polish mission and Italian missions, and of course also the early Islamic period had begun to become a focus of history. And I would say that the two places to go for much of this evidence is now Emanuele Intagliata's monograph, Palmyra After Zenobia, and of course also Denis Connequin's work on the Umayyad castles in the area. In 1976, College published his still standard work on Palmyrene art, and in the preface he stated that an international conference was held in October, marking almost to the month the 1700th anniversary of the Roman destruction of historical Palmyra, and then a first conference of Palmyrene studies was organized at Strasbourg by Bresson. One important result of that meeting was the unanimous expression of a wish to see all the extant works of Palmyrene art fully catalogued and published, and it was to be hoped then that this may become or would become possible before long. And here we are, more than 50 years later, and it still hadn't happened. But College followed in the steps of, among others, and maybe most importantly, Harald Ingholt, who in 1928 had published his habilitation in Danish, where he had included 529 Palmyrene funerary portraits. His habilitation was published in Danish, and now it exists in a translation in an updated version, which we did within the project. But despite college optimism, well, even the last 50 years of research has focused on collections or on specific objects, often highlighting the very provincial nature of Palmyra. All scholars have situated Palmyra in the debate about the continuous Greek influence in the East or that of cultural amnesia, as had been advocated by Miller in his monograph on the Roman Near East. But one reason for the often very narrow focus in Palmyrene studies is, in fact, ironically, the abundance of material. And here you just see the volumes that we have produced with conferences and workshops and in monograph shape over the last 2 years from the project. The site has indeed, for example, produced the largest corpus of still surviving locally produced limestone funerary sculptural portraits in the Roman world. And if you don't want to read all the volumes, you can also go, for example, to the just published Oxford Handbook on Palmyra, where 38 colleagues from around the world, experts on Palmyra, have contributed with their newest knowledge about the site as well. But everything begins somewhere, and of course my way into the research of Palmyra was through the Danish collection at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek. That was built up by Carl Jacobsen, the brewer of the late 19th century, who collected immense amounts of antiquities from the Greco-Roman world and also became interested in Near Eastern art, in particular because it was or constituted a very important comparison basis to his Greek and Roman collection. He worked together with Julius Leutwill, who acted as his agent in Beirut around that time. And here you just see a little citation in translation from one of Leutwill's letters to Carl Jacobsen, where he describes that there are still no Palmyrene antiquities in the large museum in Berlin, for example. So there was a lot of competition going on in the late 19th century around the build-up of these new collections of Near Eastern antiquities. And we've also been running a project on the side on the historiography of these collections. But as said, the Palmyra collection in Copenhagen is the largest one containing the funerary portraits outside of Syria in the world. And Harald Ingholt must still be considered one of the scholars who had worked until recently most intensively on these portraits. He also conducted fieldwork in Palmyra in the 1920s and excavated more than 80 graves. We published those for him now. He only published 5 of those, but in the legacy data, we found the rest, so to say, and they are now out there. And I think I have them on a slide here in a minute. But what I wanted to show you here was while the French deconstruction, among other things, of the modern village in Palmyra that was located inside the temenos of the sanctuary of Bel was going on, Harald Ingholt was working not alongside the French because he had finished his excavations by then and moved on to other parts of the Near East, but worked on his publications of the necropolis. And his legacy data has proven extremely important for us to understand the urban development of Palmyra better also in the post-classical periods. And here I just show you a few slides from the now published archives. The archives were located or are still located in the New Carlsberg Glyptotek, and so are the excavation diaries. But as said now, all this data is now available for you to consult, well, both in print, but also online, since we have put up online repositories for everyone to go and download this material as long as they cite the research that we have done on it. Yes. So back to a little bit of his legacy data. I mean, through the diaries, it has, as I said, been possible for us to re-embed a lot of lost knowledge also about the funerary portraits. Recently, I published an article together with Jen Bird and Sina Kamash, where we have trawled all the published diaries for all the objects that Ingholt bought or was given by his local workers, and where we have, and that he excavated himself as well, and where we've re-embedded all those objects into the context, the archaeological context that we could get at. And this is also published and already out there, so you can go and check some of those contexts for these until now unknown objects in that article, for example. And this is a quotation or a citation from the introduction to the very famous Recueil de Tesser, which is about the Palmyrene banqueting tickets. And here it in fact says that they, for example, were all or were given to the excavator by local workers. And you can actually only understand in what context that happens if you have a good insight into the historiography of the excavations in Palmyra, because the aerial photographs I showed you right before, showing you how the village was dismantled, meant that all these tesserae in fact came out from under the houses around the banqueting hall in Palmyra. But there is no archaeological context apart from this given to them in the corpus. So this is just to give you an insight into the complexity or the complex background for re-embedding the Palmyrene material into its context again. The funerary portraiture really remains a rich source of knowledge about life in Palmyra, and the idea with the project, with the Palmyra Portrait Project, was to collect all of these. That turned out to be a much larger assignment than we had thought. At the beginning of the project, I estimated that there were around 1,200 in the entire world, and as we stand today, we are very, very close to 4,000. So you could say that I was really entirely wrong in my estimation at the beginning of the project. We now know that these are spread across the world in at least 235 collections, and here you see a list over the largest collections in the world. It's no surprise that the Palmyra Museum and the National Museum of Damascus would have had the most. The problem with those were that they were not all catalogued at the time that the Civil War broke out. We, of course, in the project know of many more, also illicit ones, but we cannot publish those in the corpus, well, due to the international regulation of how we can work or not can work with illicitly traded material. But what we do keep is a list of everything that comes on the international auction market, but we also keep a list of what we are shown from the black market, so to say, and in that way, we know that there has been considerable trade going on in the later years as well. Here you see the breakup of all the portraits now in our database, and you see the breakup between the funerary sphere and the public sphere, and that there's a significant overweight of material coming from the funerary sphere and not that much left from the public and the religious sphere. So where has all that sculpture gone? It's perhaps not surprising, one should say, that there's not that much left from what we would term the public or the religious sphere, because the material that was outside, so to say, was easy to loot, was easy to take away, and a lot of it would have weathered over the centuries also. And here you see a division on the various groups of material of those 248 objects with portraits that are left from the non-funerary sphere. Of course, we know that marble was an imported stone to the Near East, so it was not local, and much of that would have been burned to lime slag in later periods and used for or reused in antiquity as building material also. The same goes for bronze that would have been remelted, looted, remelted. Here I show you one very interesting limestone head, which actually shows most likely that bronze was worked in Palmyra, or at least bronze techniques were known in Palmyra, because this limestone head, together with 5 others of very high quality that we know, actually imitate bronze working techniques in limestones, going to show that the artists at least had seen a fair amount of bronze sculpture and knew how these were made, and reflected that in limestone sculpture as well. There are some wall paintings left in Palmyra also. These are watercolor drawings from the grave of Hayran that actually shows two honorific statues that, so to say, were brought into the grave, painted on niche walls, most likely having been set up next to the funerary statues of Hayran and his wife. Here you see a few of the public statues left, but of course we have to imagine that the urban landscape in Palmyra would have been almost as dense as the funerary landscape, as Palmyra is one of these few urban places in the Near East where not only statues were standing on bases at the bottom of columns, but we have the long main streets and side streets with the consoles halfway up on which sculpture would also have been located. One of the main points in the project was, of course, to come up with a better chronology of the portraits, and therefore we have built in anything that's dated by inscriptions up against what is dated by firm contexts, and the rest of the objects, which are quite many, as you see here also, are dated by stylistic comparisons. But with almost 4,000, one also has to say that we have a fairly good and statistically solid group of material to work with, much better than anywhere else in the Roman world, apart from Rome-based portraits themselves. And that, of course, also maybe brings to the forefront the complexity of this material, whether it was found in situ or ex situ, whether we at all have some sort of feeling of the context for it. And I'm going to, in the last part of the talk now, show you a few case studies and show you how we've worked us through this complexity, maybe also to give you an understanding of why this has now, in fact, taken a bit more than 10 years, but luckily is coming to a close. I should also say that in this other article from 2021, 300 Years of Palmyrene History, Unlocking Archaeological Data for Studying Past Societal Transformations, you can actually go and look at the new stylistic dating that we give, and also download a list of all the material that we had available for our study at that point in time. And that was also way above 3,000 funerary portraits. These portraits were, most of them at least, these loculus portraits that were set up in the underground and the tomb tower graves in Palmyra to close off the burial niches. Well, here you see a ground plan of the hypogea and a profile plan of one of the tomb towers. And the loculus reliefs would have been set up to close off the burial shelves. However, now that we also know that far beyond 500 monumental graves existed in Palmyra, we need to really ask the question whether these graves were in fact ever intended to be entirely filled, or whether they in some aspects at least also are to be seen as expressions simply of elite culture in Palmyra. In Palmyra, mummification was used, and here you see the mummy that Carl Jacobsen bought and had brought to Copenhagen, wrapped in textiles in antiquity, placed on the shelf that was then closed off. It was not mummification as we know it from Egypt, where the organs were taken out, but simply a basic form of mummification with perfumes and oils and textiles, which to a certain extent also have been found in some of the graves that have not been entirely looted. As part of our studies, we have restudied every single grave in Palmyra, also as far as we could, as far as they were published, and have counted and recounted them. And here you see the numbers of what is left: the tower tombs 164, hypogea 170, temple, the so-called temple tombs 68, and also some that were so that has been so damaged that we actually can't say whether they were temple tombs or foundations for tower tombs. Of course, there were also CEST graves and single graves, but only 54 of those have been published from Palmyra, although so many more must have existed. In the column to your right, you actually see the graves that contain in situ context, and you see how that stands in stark contrast from the total number of graves. So we do not have that many in situ contexts. And I think I'm just going to skip these ground plans to not go over time and go to the few case studies on the complexity of known and unknown funerary contexts. So the graph to your left here shows you the total number of objects that we've been working with, and that's not the same as this total number of portraits, because, for example, the sarcophagi or reliefs could hold several portraits. So now we are operating here in these graphs with the object numbers. And on the graph, you see how many object numbers in percentage come without a known context. So 72%, only 28% have a context. And if we talk about these 810 objects with a known context, then you see on the graph to your right that only 37% of those actually have secure in situ context, which is not very much. And most of them only have a fine spot, which was not their original in situ context. So we've gone through all that published material to resituate these objects in their original grave contexts. And we've partly done that through Harald Ingholt's excavation diaries, through the very precise but unpublished mapping he had done in the 1920s of all the graves that he excavated. And I just give you one example here, Klaus Schnedelbach's published plan of the Southwest necropolis, but now overlain with our results, which we published together with Schnedelbach a few years ago, that gives you a very good impression of how we now can do things in much higher resolution. We added 28 ground plans to his map and corrected the location of at least 6 graves, for example. But if we take that to the level of the single grave, what we've been able to do with a lot of the graves, at least 80 of these, is to make much better plans of the graves, much more precise plans, not only location-wise, but also interior-wise, and also resituate, as you see on this plan to your left. You see the Hypogeum number 5, the very famous tomb of Artaban, where we also now can resituate a few more portraits in their precise in situ situation. And you see the mapping that we have done that include basic gender, male, female, child, priestly representation, so on and so forth, so that we can begin to work with the makeup of the few in situ situations in some of the family graves. It, of course, also brings out a lot of problems very clearly in the way that you can see that no single grave context has not been disturbed. But maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion. This is also a map that really shows you some of that complexity in graph form. And here you see how few tombs, in fact, have securely provenance sculptures. The orange slots show you that, divided on the various necropolis of Palmyra. And just to give you one last example here, to show you what is upcoming in our new in situ monograph, a new ground plan of every single grave in Palmyra with all the in situ portraits resituated for all 90 graves in Palmyra in the way that you see on this map, and this map both from the tomb of Artaban. We've worked with didactics ways of recontextualizing the legacy material, and some of you might know this publication that we published a few years ago, where we have resituated both the legacy data of Harald Ingholt and his diary into a digital model that you can use for teaching, or well, you can use if you are interested in seeing the process of how we worked, resituated the wall paintings in the larger grade plan, for example. This, of course, also brings to the forefront how full of lacuna this material is, but at least it gives you an impression of what it is that we've had to work with. I think as a very last thing, not to go too much over time, I'm just going to very briefly speak to you about the almost 800 sarcophagi, which actually is out now as a corpus published by Olympia Bubu and myself last year. It's the largest sarcophagus, published sarcophagus corpus from outside of Rome, with these more than 750 sarcophagi still existing. As you can see here, very dense portrait galleries of families also, and plenty of these we have actually also been able to resituate in a variety of graves in the city through, among other things, again, Harl Ingholt's legacy data. Here, his fieldwork diaries, where you can see his drawings of the famous sarcophagus from the grave of Mackay, which we've now been able to situate back in its in situ find context. Of course, there are plenty of other aspects that we can now delve into, such as comparing gender division between the public and the funerary sphere, holding it up against the insecurity calculations of how much sculpture potentially has gone lost, both in the funerary sphere and in the public sphere. You see here that there's a significant difference in the percentages showing women in the public sphere and women in the funerary sphere, for example. Maybe not surprising, but now we at least have numbers on these things. What we have been able to go into much more detail with, of course, is also developing dress codes over time, or studying phenomena that were imported from the Roman cultural sphere, like clavi on tunic. We've also done a set of polychromy studies that can mostly be done, of course, on the material that we know from the black market, so to say. This is a bust that has come freshly out of the ground, so to say, and there you see the very stark pink color on the tunic of this Palmyrene priest, for example. One very last case study that I just wanted to show that sort of underlines the historical importance of what we are looking at is, in this case, the military armed presence in the sculptural corpus. Out of these almost 4,000 locally produced limestone sculptures, we have 26 objects that depict men with Roman swords and other weapons. So that's not very much. And in the same corpus, we have 64 representations of men carrying Parthian-style weapons. The ones carrying Roman weapons are divided like this over time, not surprisingly, with two smaller peaks in the middle of the 2nd century and in the late 2nd century AD, coinciding with a larger presence of Roman military in Palmyra. And here you just see some of these examples. But in this case, one of the very later ones actually stands entirely out. And that is a very famous portrait, which has been known for a long time. It is in the Newcastle Bibliothèque collection. It is Nurbel surrounded by two of his children. He has always been interpreted as a Roman soldier, but nobody has actually ever really looked at him and seen that not only was he a soldier, but in his right hand, he's also holding a viti staff. So he was, in fact, a centurion. This is a portrait that stems from the 3rd century, dated to between 230 and 250, coinciding most likely with a higher presence of the army in Palmyra due to a larger instability out on the eastern border. At the same time, we have a huge surge in the representations of men carrying Parthian-style weapons in this period. And here you see how their chronology are divided. 35 days to the first half of the 3rd century AD and 18 to the second half. So that is an interesting observation in this large corpus, that even though these are two small groups, we see the intensification of these representations in the 3rd century, when Palmyra, in fact, begins to swing towards the east, so to say. And recently, I published a hypothesis on that, and on the fact that we believe that the Palmyrenes mobilized their resources to go east for the invasion of Hatra in 239 and for Dura Europos in 240, something which we cannot see in the historical sources. Very, very last but not least, I should mention our inscription project, where we have collected all preserved inscriptions from Palmyra as well, all the funerary inscriptions, more than 1,000, the public inscriptions, more than 1,100, and another almost 900 inscriptions from the banqueting tesserae, and are also now, together with Jean-Baptiste John, of course, in the process of modeling those up against all the sculptural material, the architectural material, to see how this correlates with the development of the city or not. And interestingly enough, I can tell you that it doesn't correlate entirely, but in the inscriptions of the 3rd century, we do not see the same instability as we see in the sculptural production. And there are many reasons for that. And I think, that's something that we can say for the discussion, if some of you are interested in hearing more about that. So I just highlighted a few things here that has come out of these more than 10 years of research. And it's basically only now that we can really begin to work with the complexities of what happens to our understanding of this society when we recontextualize the images of Palmyra. And then I should, of course, say thank you to everybody who's been part of this project, both are now and have been in the past, because without them, this could not have happened. As you see, the material is abundant, and this can only happen as a team and as a developing team, and also with external collaborators. So thank you very much to them, and thank you very much to the audience for bearing over with me going over time anyhow.